So, imagine that you're a farmer in central Mexico. Not an Aztec farmer, but one of their neighbors, which is a bad career choice apparently. One morning, warriors show up, not because they want your land, not because they want your crop, they want you alive. Because somewhere on top of a pyramid, someone has decided that the gods are hungry. Well, welcome to the Aztec Empire, one of the most impressive civilizations in human history, and also a masterclass in how to make every single neighbor hate you. The most well-known version of this story is simple. A handful of evil Spaniards show up and brutally crush the innocent, helpless Aztec Empire. And look, the Spaniards were absolutely awful. This is not a "the conquistadors were misunderstood" video. Relax, internet. However, there is one tiny problem with that story. It is mathematically ridiculous. Hernán Cortés landed with a few hundred men, and the Aztecs had tens of thousands of warriors and ruled over millions of people. If a few hundred sweaty Europeans conquered the Aztec Empire all by themselves, the Aztec would have been the most useless military power in recorded history. And they were not. They were actually terrifyingly good. The truth is messier, more interesting and considerably worse for the Aztecs' reputation. The Spanish did not conquer the Aztecs alone. They had tens of thousands of indigenous people helping them do it. And they helped because, let's be honest, the Aztecs, they kinda sucked. Now, before anyone starts crying, let's be fair. The Aztecs were genuinely extraordinary. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, sat on an island in Lake Texcoco. It had causeways, canals, floating farms called chinampas, enormous markets, temples. It was not a city, it was a statement. At its peak, it may have had around 200,000 people. It is not a cute village with feathers, that is a monster city, it is a metropolis. In fact, Spanish soldiers who saw it were stunned, and for once they were not being dramatic. Aqueducts, markets, botanical gardens, palaces, a level of urban planning that would make some modern suburbs look like crime scenes. The Aztecs were not primitive, they were not stupid, they were not sitting around waiting to be conquered by the next European nation. They built one of the most powerful states in the Americas. And they used that power like an imperial gym bro, just discovered taxation and human sacrifice on the same afternoon. The Aztec Empire was not held together by everyone singing about unity. It was held together by conquest, tribute, and the very clear understanding that annoying Tenochtitlan was a terrible idea. Conquered city-states owed tribute, food, textiles, luxury goods, warriors, labor. The empire was a giant funnel, and Tenochtitlan was the mouth. And if you did not pay, well, the Aztecs had customer support. It was called an army. And that is where the rose-colored glasses need to come off. The Aztecs were impressive. They were also very skilled, making people absolutely terrified of them. And that distinction matters enormously for what happens next. Which brings us to one of the most extraordinary pieces of imperial branding in history, the dedication of Templo Mayor. Now, you may have heard that the Spanish sources massively exaggerated Aztec human sacrifices in order to justify their conquest. And yes, obviously, the Spanish had every incentive to say, hey, look, your majesty, we had to conquer them. Very tragic. Anyway, here's the gold. But this is the most interesting part. They did not need to actually invent the horror story from scratch. According to various accounts, some Spanish but some later indigenous sources, the Aztecs themselves promoted the idea that tens of thousands of captives were sacrificed at Templo Mayor ceremonies. The famous number is the 80,400 over 4 days. Is that number real? Almost certainly not. That is not a ceremony, that is a meat processing startup with religious branding. However, lower estimates still put the figures in the thousands, which over 4 days is horrifying enough. But the exact number is not the point. The point is that this number was very useful. The Aztecs wanted their neighbors to believe that they were capable of doing something like that. Imagine inviting your neighboring rulers to your capital implying, welcome, enjoy the food, enjoy the city, and also, we can do this to your people if you misbehave or if we just feel like it. That is not religion, that is politics with a very sharp knife. Once you understand that, the whole conquest starts looking less like a random tragedy and more like a PR strategy finally catching fire. Now, we also need to talk about the Flower Wars, because apparently regular empire building was not complicated enough. The Flower Wars were ritualized conflicts between the Aztecs and rival states, particularly Tlaxcala. Historians still debate the purpose, and the honest answer is training, politics, pressure, religion, drought management, all of the above at once. History is messy. However, one thing is very clear: capturing live prisoners mattered enormously. In most wars, you just defeat the enemy. In Aztec warfare, defeating him was fine. However, bringing him home alive was where the real career progression happened. For the people on the receiving end, this was not a fun, cultural, exchange program. It meant living next to a superpower that looked at your sons and saw, a future offering. Which is why the next part matters. Meet the Tlaxcalans. Modern history has often called the Tlaxcalans traitors, the people who handed over the indigenous world to Cortés, which sounds damning until you ask one basic question. There was no Mexico in 1519. There was no unified indigenous nation. There was no Team Jersey that said, Mesoamerica United. The Tlaxcalans were not Aztec citizens betraying their own country. They were an independent enemy state who had been fighting with the Aztecs for generations. They were encircled, cut off from trade goods, and targeted again and again and again by the Flower Wars, and the stands were being taken. So when Cortés arrived, Tlaxcalans did not see a foreigner invader to be resisted for the sake of future national identity. They saw a heavily armed wildcard who despised the worst enemy. That is not treason, that is geopolitics. Imagine your neighbor has been raiding you for generations and generations, and then a suspicious man with horses and terrible facial hair offers to help. You don't love him, but you're probably going to take that meeting. Calling that treason doesn't really make sense. It's like blaming the person who joined the resistance for the actions of the occupation. The Tlaxcalans were not betraying the Aztecs. They were trying to survive them. And this changes the conquest story completely. Cortés did not arrive with some unstoppable European war machine. He arrived with what was essentially a heavily armed startup. His greatest weapon was not steel, it wasn't gunpowder, it wasn't horses. His greatest weapon was recognizing that the Aztec Empire was sitting on a mountain of resentment. In fact, the final march on Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztecs, was not Spaniards versus an empire, it was a coalition. Tlaxcalans, Huayos Incas, Totonacs, Texcocans, tens of thousands of people with their own reasons to want Tenochtitlan gone. They provided warriors, scouts, food, porters, intelligence, and the vast majority of the actual manpower. The Spanish did not simply conquer Mexico, they exploited a political catastrophe that the Aztecs had spent decades constructing. The fall of Tenochtitlan was not only a European conquest, but it was also an indigenous war against the Aztec Empire. And yes, diseases mattered, Spanish violence mattered, technology mattered, and none of these excuses the colonizers. History is not a Marvel movie with one cause and one villain. But if your empire collapses because every single neighbor immediately joins the first stranger who shows up with a sword, maybe the neighbors were trying to tell you something. So, did the Aztecs actually suck? Well, culturally, no. Artistically, no. Architecturally, absolutely not. Tenochtitlan was magnificent. The agriculture was ingenious. The military was disciplined. And the world was complex, rich, fascinating. But geopolitically, oh yes, they sucked. They built an empire powerful enough to dominate central Mexico, and despised enough that the right enemy appeared, half of the neighborhood helped kick the door in. And that is the part that people skip when they call the Tlaxcalans traitors. Tlaxcalans did not betray a unified indigenous brotherhood. They fought the empire that had been targeting for generations and generations. Did they make a deal with a monster? Yes. Did that monster eventually betray and dominate them too? Also yes. The Spanish Empire was not known for wholesome long-term partnerships. But that is the tragedy, not that the Aztec Empire fell. Empires fall all the time, especially when they spend their existence making enemies like it is a loyalty rewards program. The tragedy is that the people who helped bring it down did not get freedom. They got a completely different empire instead. Justice for the Tlaxcalans means getting the story right. They were not cartoon villains, they were not simple traitors, they were people caught between a brutal neighbor and a dangerous opportunity, and they made the only choice that made sense. As for the Aztecs, well, they were brilliant, they were terrifying, they were sophisticated, and they were cruel. They were all four simultaneously without any contradiction. They built one of the greatest cities on earth, and they built the list of people willing to help destroy it. So maybe the real surprise is not that the Aztec Empire fell, but maybe the real surprise is that they convinced the modern world to feel sorry for them